as much as brown fat has a higher metabolic rate than white fat, it will go quiet. It will turn down its engine unless you fire it up, which when you get into the Morozko forge, you are firing that up. When you get cold, you now turn it on. And so even though at rest, its metabolic rate is still higher than white fat, but when you turn it on, now you're really cooking with gas. Now you're getting like a 10x increase in metabolic rate. Now, Thomas, the interesting thing, of course, about brown fat, when I first got interested in brown fat, and my research is reflective of this, it has been really through the lens of the endogenous signals that are regulating brown fat. Specifically, of course, as you may already know, my research focused on the contrasting effects of insulin versus ketones, where insulin has this suppressive effect on adipocyte beiging and brown fat activation at an endocrine level, and then at a nutrient level, ketones have the exact opposite. They have a stimulating effect on beiging white fat and on activating brown fat. And then the whole, I was aware of cold therapy, of course, but I didn't come to this from the point of cold immersion, cold therapy. That was just the sort of parallel awareness in my mind, and it's still not something I've researched, like, that I've actually conducted experiments on. We have not had people going through cold therapy pulling fat biopsies before and after. That's an interesting area of research. We've never gotten into it. Just so you know, as much as I'm not even a brown fat guy, I'm a mitochondria guy. Mitochondria is my expertise. I'm just familiar with the context of the mitochondria and their differences in behavior between white fat to brown fat, and of course, all kinds of other tissues. So the whole, I remember the first time I was on like a podcast talking about these findings, and someone then brought up Wim Hof and cold therapy. And I thought in real time, I'm thinking, what the hell are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't know who Wim Hof was. I'm not a cold therapy guy. I just knew mitochondria,
Yeah.
And so I end up stumbling through some answer. I don't even remember what podcast it was, but thinking, man, I got to look this guy up, and get familiar. And that was sort of the beginning of me looking more into cold therapy. Now, as much as I stated earlier how my focus has been the endogenous signals, cold therapy is still an endogenous signal, but it starts with an external stimulus, which is sort of the unique aspect of it.
Appreciate that there are now things there's someone called a brown fat scientist. You can, I don't know, go to Germany, you get a dissertation on brown fat, and it's a little bit different than, adjacent to what you're doing, but a little bit different than insulin and mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
But the brown fat are packed with mitochondria.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to ask you, what can we do to take care of our mitochondria?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Without a real definitive answer, but I'm gonna give you one anyway. If someone, the question being, what is the best way to ensure the mitochondria are working well? But even then, Thomas, it's really interesting, and I'll just sort of riff for a second. We say, okay, so I'll answer the question explicitly. The answer would be to make sure that the electron transport system is operating properly, that as electrons are getting handled from through the complexes, that there's no breaks, if you will, that you aren't getting a point of disruption that is having the electrons get off the system, the electron transport system, and then creating oxidative stress. I would say that is the cleanest, neatest answer. Now, having said that, I am amused when I hear conversations like on the radio about weight loss, and someone will say, you got to take our fat burner or whatever. It improves mitochondrial efficiency. I've heard that stated. And I think to myself, that's like the last thing you want.
It's going the wrong way.
Yeah, where it sounds good, but if you're talking about the mitochondria in your fat cells, you want those to be the least efficient mitochondria in your entire body. Now, at muscle tissue, you'd want it to be perfectly efficient and very tightly coupled. And so again, the answer to the question, is defining the mitochondria as making sure the electron transport systems are working. And that would be generally not exposing the mitochondria to noxious stimuli like certain drugs like metformin, which I know many longevity gurus encourage, and I am very opposed, unless the person is incapable of exercise. If a person can't exercise, metformin is a good way to improve insulin resistance. If they can exercise, then it does more harm than good because of what it does to the mitochondria. Or, and depending on any other chemicals they're exposed to that may inhibit various complexes on the electron transport system. But other than that, being mindful of what you're putting into your body, then it's just a matter of how can I selectively uncouple my mitochondria, the electron transport from oxidative phosphorylation. And Thomas, I don't want to elaborate on that if this is something you're already familiar with. You've probably heard the term uncoupling, especially with regards to brown fat. Not only do brown fat cells have way more mitochondria, which is what is literally giving some of their pigment. That is why they're so dark. It's because of the high preponderance of mitochondria. But the mitochondria themselves are behaving very differently because they're uncoupled. And by uncoupled, I mean these two fundamental biochemical processes, namely electron transport system and oxidative phosphorylation. So, taking the chemiosmotic energy created from electron transport and then leveraging it to create ATP, those two processes, the more they're linked or coupled, then we say they're coupled, very tightly coupled, or we could say very efficient. We would want muscle, for example, to be very efficient. Otherwise, we'd have a hard time getting anything done. So if the muscle's burning energy, we want to be getting chemical energy from it in the form of ATP or potential chemical energy. Whereas fat cells, which have such a low metabolic rate, such a low demand for work, if we can get them to start idling the engine higher, revving the gas, but keeping the car out of gear, that's the metaphor I've used before, where you're riding the clutch a lot. So the RPMs are really high, but the speed is really low. You've uncoupled the burning of the engine with the movement of the car. It's a terrible way to get good miles per gallon, but it's a great way to burn fat, of course. So that's the way I like people to think about the power of brown fat. But even brown fat, as much as brown fat has a higher metabolic rate than white fat, it will go quiet. It will turn down its engine unless you fire it up, which when you get into the Morozko forge, you are firing that up. When you get cold, you now turn it on. And so even though at rest, its metabolic rate is still higher than white fat, but when you turn it on, now you're really cooking with gas. Now you're getting like a 10x increase in metabolic rate at fat tissue. And fat tissue metabolic rate matters as much as people think it's irrelevant. Even in a normal weight individual, adipose tissue accounts for about 10% of the whole body metabolic rate. So this is a meaningful amount.
The metaphor I use that I want to run past you is everyone understands that you exercise your muscles, you'll do temporary damage to your muscles. When you recover, they come back stronger. And so the analogy to brown fat is you get in the cold, you activate your brown fat, and of course, your body responds in between periods of cold. And it does it with mitobiogenesis. That is, It improves the quantity and the quality of your mitochondria, and by recruiting new brown fat or beiging your white fat cells. This is a kind of a classic hormetic response to the stress of the cold. And most people get that analogy. I think it's imperfect because the mechanisms by which they're using energy and what they're doing with the energy is different. But people appreciate that your body acclimates to the cold the more you're putting it in the cold. Does that sound right to you?
Yep. Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a good description.
Well, here's the other thing that I've written in this book, and it's more speculative. So the way I describe it is as speculation, but we got to start with hypotheses somewhere. I've written that there are 3 routes to mitochondrial injury. The first one that people are familiar with would be an excess of carbohydrates. And you could be exercising, you could be getting cold, but it's possible to eat your way even beyond the rate at which you would be consuming these carbohydrates. So excess carbohydrates, it overloads the melatonin in the mitochondria and their capacity to absorb reactive oxygen species. The reactive oxygen species that are produced under excess carbohydrates in your diet, they damage the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria can recover, but for right now, we're talking about the 3 ways to injure them. Here's the 2 that most people don't know. The second one is light. Malillumination is a term that not a lot of people use. Some people call it light abuse. But if you don't get enough dark cycled with light, your mitochondria, this is the speculation, mitochondria make their own melatonin. We know that. And if you don't have the right light cycle, then your mitochondria could be deficient in melatonin. And melatonin is the molecule that absorbs excess reactive oxygen species. So this second pathway to mitochondrial injury would be a deficiency of melatonin inside the mitochondria, not the type that is produced in the pineal gland. It's too far away from the whole rest of the body, but their own mitochondria, leaving them vulnerable to excess carbohydrates. Here's the third, and I'm really out on a limb with this. When we consume too many seed oils, everybody thinks that fat is for energy, and it's true. But fat is also incorporated structurally as a material into, for example, the membranes of our cells. And when we get the wrong membranes, I can't say exactly whether this is mitochondrial injury or if it just slows down the transport of glucose across the cell membrane in a way that makes us insulin resistant, even if the mitochondria are intact, slowing down the action of insulin, slowing down the glucose metabolism, and stimulating excess insulin production inside the body because the cell membrane is deformed in this way. So I'm running those 3 past you, and I see you nodding, and I'm ready for reactions.
Yes. So that's a really good point, and I think it's a very strong one. I would say particularly looking at the linoleic acid metabolites and how they disrupt mitochondrial dynamics. Omega-6 fats, linoleic acid, they have the potential to be burned. I mean, that's important to note, especially because that's become such a boogeyman, and rightly so. I agree with that view. I think some people refuse to acknowledge the fact that omega-6 fats can be burned. And they are burned very readily, but that's of course at more modest amounts where we far overwhelm the ability of the mitochondria to burn these for fuels, and then they go down the route of creating these radical versions of themselves, like 4-H-E, etc. What I think, to elaborate on that point, which I think you should, I would suggest diving into the literature a little bit and look and just finding evidence of omega-6 fats, maybe just linoleic acid specifically, either directly compromising electron transport system, electron carriers, the complexes, or affecting dynamics, like perhaps it's forcing mitochondrial fission. Rather than allowing it to undergo fusion and fission, which is what the cell needs. We published a paper a couple years ago that found that chronic hyperinsulinemia resulted in the accumulation of a very highly active lipid. It's a type of sphingolipid called ceramides, and then ceramides were forcing the mitochondria into a state of sustained fission.
No kidding.
And that is not healthy. That is not good. Yeah, we published this paper probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe even a little more now, actually. Anyway, so this definitely touches on this. That directly starts to connect the hyperinsulinemic aspect of damaging mitochondria. But I think it would be pretty easy to find further evidence of these omega-6 fats getting enriched in like cardiolipin, and then affecting mitochondrial dynamics at a minimum. So yeah, that's a really, really good point. One that I would not have remembered if you hadn't prompted it. But yeah, I think it's definitely worth focusing on. But with regards to light as well, I know you're mentioning melatonin, and I don't know a lot about this as much as I'm kind of a mitochondria guy, but light itself, I believe, the wavelength of light itself can have a direct effect. There was a rodent study that I saw years ago looking at the penetration of like red light and how it activates through opsonins, these light sensitive proteins. It induced a greater, I think it was a greater state of mitochondrial uncoupling with the red light therapy. In fact, we were going to do a study. I just couldn't get funding for it, but someone sent us the red lamps and we still have them here somewhere on campus. We were going to do pre and post adipose biopsies, do a biopsy, measure mitochondrial bioenergetics and coupling, have them go through this light therapy for a month, and then do a post biopsy and just compare the pre and post. But anyway, we just couldn't, we never moved forward with it, but it was based on these animal studies that I'd seen.
I've been reading more and more about light. There are two wavelengths of light that dominate the forest. Green, which ought to be obvious to us because those are the leaves of the trees, and red near infrared, so slightly higher than 700 nanometers. And I'm like, well, when do you ever see red in the forest? But it's the combination of the green and the red that makes the brown in the bark. I mean, there's lots of different colors, and the dominant wavelengths are different than what we perceive as the color. So I'm still sorting this out. But there's a paper from Santa Barbara, 1993, John Endler, and he compiled all this data for us around the world, Costa Rica, New Guinea, Vermont, you know, measuring the dominant wavelengths. It's 550 nanometers, which is green, and slightly more than 700, about 720, which is red near infrared.
Huh.
When we don't get enough infrared light, our body is expecting it. And just like it's expecting exercise or expecting a certain amount of nutrition or expecting cold. And we become dysregulated in ways that that are maladaptive because we're not getting the infrared. And then you could say, well, you know, why would we have a deficit of infrared? And the answer is because I have these high efficiency windows in my office and in my apartment. And all of the high efficiency windows are intended to reflect out the IR to reduce my heating bills, for example, in Arizona. Because you know, it's 110 degrees here. You think we get plenty of light and plenty of infrared. But the fact is, people in Arizona, they hole up. They're always indoors during the summer. They only go out in winter when there's very little UV. You can get some IR. We are so protected from normal wavelengths of light, what I call normal, sort of our evolutionarily adapted wavelengths of light, that we are in a chronic state of malillumination. The last one is,
no, that's a good term.
Yeah, part of the reason I like Provo is because I get up where there's trees. I mean, you know, I went hiking into the forest. I went and visited one of the hot springs that are there. It's gorgeous. And guess what? You feel great. Forest bathing is a practice in Japan, and they've done clinical trials on people who spend 2 or 3 hours just walking in the forest and compared them to people who walk on the track or at the gym or something like that. The forest has healing properties. It reduces anxiety, it reduces pain, or at least the perception of pain, and it speeds wound healing. And it might be because of the things in the air, but if it were, it would depend upon the plant species. Is it deciduous? You know, is it coniferous? And it doesn't. The light of the shaded forest is the same around the world, and the benefits of forest bathing are the same around the world. So I started a green light company. The green is really good for interrupting or subtracting the pain of migraine and headaches and reducing anxiety.
Like, what's your protocol? When are you doing it? What kind of exposure on the body? I'd be really interested because I'm not familiar with this.
Well, then it's great because the light connection to the mitochondria is getting stronger. Like, you know, you have an idea and you think, well, that's intriguing. And then the more papers that I read, the more credibility this idea has.
Yeah.
There are more mitochondria per unit cell in the retina than anywhere else in the body. Why is that?
Yeah, I did not know that.
That for me, that is a fascinating question. Evidently, processing light into like nerve signals, maybe that takes a lot of energy. So that's one way of looking at it, but it's not the only way. It's something I got to figure out more of. What is going on between light, both in our retina and throughout the rest of our body? And on this one, Jack Kruse, he won't shut up about it. And I don't understand 90% of what that man says.
Who is it? Jack Kruse?
Jack Kruse. Yeah, he's on Twitter. He will go off on rants that make you feel stupid for asking a question. He's very difficult to recommend, Ben, because you're a gentleman, and Jack grew up on Long Island or something. He's always in your face.
Just a crank, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He did a long podcast with Rick Rubin and Andrew Huberman, and he was rude to Andrew in a way that I found distasteful, but it doesn't mean he's wrong. So he's going on and on about light, and he's a cold guy. And I try and learn what I can from Jack, but I do a lot better when I go into the journal articles.
Yeah, I hear you. Now, how do you spell his last name? Is it just like a rowing crew?
Kruse. So it's counterintuitive.
Okay, I was totally wrong. Okay.
Yeah. He's a big Bitcoin guy on Twitter. So there's a lot to sort through when you're following Jack.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yep.
I got a guy in my neighborhood is a big Bitcoiner. To be honest, I'm kind of warming up quite quickly to the.
I have the same feeling.
But especially just as the dollar and things continue to just go insane, and I do worry about the long-term value of the dollar. I'm still kind of skeptical about Bitcoin, but I appreciate it from an academic view. I appreciate this a hard currency that is resistant to inflation. Impervious to it, in fact. I appreciate that. It's just kind of overwhelming, to know how to get into it and what to do with your wallet and everything else.
Yep. When my kids were little and they lost a tooth, they got a 1 ounce silver coin because I wanted them to want it to save it, instead of go spend it. I wanted it to be special, and I wanted them to understand what money was. And it, kind of feels more substantial to them. But at the time, silver was like $6 an ounce or something like that. It was really easy for me to buy a bunch of silver coins. Then it zoomed all the way up to 30 something. And I'm like, it's a good thing you don't have any more teeth in you to lose in your head. So there are other things besides Bitcoin. I'm attracted to silver and gold for the same reasons. And I just can't get my head around Bitcoin yet.
Yeah, I know. It's a lingering frustration.
Okay, so back to some questions. I'm glad to hear that you are critical of metformin. And because my impression of metformin is that it overcomes insulin resistance without doing anything to support mitochondrial function, or without
in fact, it hurts. Yeah. So there are for being the most widely used anti-diabetic drug in the world, we know a lot less than people think when it comes to metformin. So I want to acknowledge that there are undoubtedly, positively mechanisms that I'm not aware of. However, I was part of a group, and we published a paper a number of years ago finding that part of the mechanism of metformin is that it inhibits complex 1 of the electron transport system. By inhibiting complex 1, you get less ATP produced. By getting less ATP produced, you activate AMPK. And when AMPK is activated, of course, now you increase glycolysis, albeit in this case it would be cytosolic or non-oxidative, anaerobic glycolysis, we call it sometimes. But even still, that helps glucose levels come down and the bodies become more insulin sensitive. Now, there are other effects, but that play into the benefits of metformin, but that one effect explains how this group at Colorado State, what they found in humans, finding that when you took a group of humans and had them go through some aerobic exercise protocols, Their insulin sensitivity got better, and their mitochondria got better. However, when you coupled the aerobic exercise with metformin, the metformin undid the benefits. Both, it undid the mitochondrial adaptation and it undid the improvements in insulin sensitivity, which is why when these longevity gurus, which I have very little respect for, because the entire premise of longevity is based on extrapolation. And I don't like extrapolation as a basic scientist. I'm uncomfortable with the assumptions that are made. And every longevity guru, every single one has to rely on extrapolation because there are simply no studies on human longevity that can answer these questions. It's impossible. And so they're always basing it on in vitro studies or at best an animal study under these perfect conditions, and they're all genetically identical, and you're controlling literally every variable of their life. You cannot connect that to a human without a tremendous amount of assumptions,
Sure.
which they're very comfortable with. So, but these longevity gurus, they say in one breath, they would say you need to exercise. And in the next breath, they'd say, and you all need to be on metformin. Those two don't work. My thought is you do one or the other. If you are incapable of exercise for whatever reason, all right, metformin. Mind you, I would also say contrasting temperature therapies too, frankly.
I would say the same thing. Sauna and cold are both good for mitobiogenesis.
Do both.
Vasodilation.
Do both. That's right. But then but if you can do exercise, don't touch metformin. But they don't say that. They don't want to acknowledge it.
This is an incredibly important warning for type 2 diabetics and insulin resistant people who are looking for a pill that will reduce their HbA1c. But I'm becoming of the opinion that it is not the blood glucose that is the problem. That is, everybody thinks insulin resistance is the problem. Insulin resistance, in my view, is the body's search for a solution to an underlying deeper problem, which I suspect is mitochondrial damage.
Insulin resistance is an adaptation. It ends up being ultimately a pathological adaptation because there's only so much you can adapt to a noxious stimulus. If you think of insulin resistance as like it's like a callus, over something that's been aggravated. The metabolism is getting worn and roughed. Well, insulin resistance it ends up being a bit of a protective phenomenon, although there are myriad origins to insulin resistance. As much as I posit there are three primary, there's some tissue level complication in this too. But I believe insulin resistance starts at fat cells. The fat cell becomes insulin resistant to prevent further growth. Because it reaches a point of maximum dimension. And so it is an adaptation in an effort to maintain homeostasis, but there's only so much homeostasis to be achieved in a noxious stimulus or environment, I should say.
I'm so glad to hear you say this. I'm tired. I have a cousin who's type 2 diabetic. He's on insulin. And I just shudder to think he really likes his doctor. This is what his doctor recommends. And he's a heart attack waiting to happen because the insulin is even worse in my mind than the blood sugar.
Completely. Okay. The giving a type 2 diabetic insulin is making them fatter and sicker and killing them faster. Now, to your point though, about mitochondria being at the root of the problem, that paradigm is supported if you look at the the predictive role of lactate in the progression of type 2 diabetes. When most people think of lactate, they only think of Tour de France and aerobic exercise and looking at the lactate threshold. And sure, that's neat. I mean, that's definitely an interesting insight into the switching over of anaerobic to aerobic metabolism. But at the same time, lactate is an energy. It is a caloric molecule that can get pulled into the mitochondria and reduced for energy and broken into acetyl-CoA. It gets metabolized, in other words, for energy. Most people don't appreciate that, but it can only be used in the mitochondria. And as you see in someone who's progressing towards metabolic dysfunction, lactate levels start to get higher and higher and higher. It is predicting a future diabetes diagnosis, but it is reflecting a real-time inability of the mitochondria to metabolize lactate. So if lactate levels are going up, it suggests this is a body that does not have adequate mitochondria, which is one of the reasons why when the time comes that they release a continuous lactate monitor, and it will come, then that people are going to only ever talk about it in the context of exercise, which I get. I'm going to say, oh yeah, but what's your fasting lactate? If it's too high, you got the mitochondria problem.
It would also be a marker of cancer risk, I wager.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure you're right. Yep. Or yeah, cancer prevalence even.
Yeah.
You know.
You wrote something in Why We Get Sick, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have it memorized, but you said that pregnancy is a natural state of increasing insulin resistance.
Yep.
And you didn't go much into it. That is, you didn't explain how this is happening or is beneficial to the fetus or to the mother. You stated as fact, and it's true, pregnancy must be the most metabolically demanding thing that a human being can do. But I'll tell you why I'm asking. A lot of pregnant women or women seeking to conceive have asked me, is it safe for me to continue with my cold exposure? Can I do ice baths when I'm pregnant? They're very concerned about this. And so I've written a couple of articles, and touching anything on pregnancy is like the third rail of trying to get yourself criticized. But I came out and said that ice baths were a wonderful thing for pregnant women to do. They get a metabolic boost. They get some anti-inflammation that the women who have done it have reported very good things to me. And when I read your line about pregnancy is a natural state of increasing insulin resistance, I started looking at preeclampsia, eclampsia, the disorders that show up in late-term pregnancy and how they're related to the metabolism. And I said, I've got to ask you more about what do you mean? Why is that the case? And what can pregnant women do about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it is one of the two times of physiological insulin resistance as opposed to pathological, of course, which is the insulin resistance I always talk about in particular. So physiological insulin resistance, in other words, the body's become insulin resistant for a purpose. Pregnancy in this case, and puberty in the other case, the two Ps. And what they both have in common is explosive growth. Insulin is anabolic, and by selectively making some tissues insulin resistant, you allow other tissues which have not become insulin resistant to benefit from a very anabolic environment stimulated by insulin and growth hormone at the same time. In fact, growth hormone is relevant because it will make tissues insulin resistant. Not all of them. Insulin resistance is never a universal phenomenon in the body. Otherwise, we would die very quickly. But growth hormone also stimulates nutrient mobilization. It wants to increase glucose. It wants to increase free fatty acids to fuel the growth that insulin is signaling. Because, of course, insulin, we always think most clinicians fall into this trap of thinking insulin's only relevant insofar as it lowers glucose. That is one of many things insulin does. It is, in fact, I would even argue it's a modest thing that insulin does. Insulin tells cells what to do with energy. Lowering glucose is just a reflection of this. So nevertheless, these periods of explosive growth, in both instances, puberty and pregnancy, it is influenced by growth hormone very, very powerfully, whether it's growth hormone from the pituitary gland in the child or whether it's growth hormone from the placenta as it is in the pregnancy. Human placental growth hormone, the amount of growth hormone she's making from her placenta actually outpaces the amount coming from the pituitary gland by a lot. Even in maternal circulation, that becomes the main source of growth hormone. Growth hormone is an insulin antagonist because insulin wants to store energy. Growth hormone wants to mobilize it. Now, of course, between the two, we have insulin like growth factor 1 in particular, although there's 2 and 3, but the IGFs are a little more on the side of acting like insulin acts, but opposing some of those actions, but facilitating others is growth hormone itself. So in pregnancy, the insulin resistance is a product of growth hormone and progesterone. Progesterone also has an insulin resistance inducing effect. And of course, progesterone, being the hormone of gestation, is going up higher and higher and higher throughout pregnancy, which matches very well and largely provides part of the explanation for why insulin resistance is also steadily climbing. But progesterone is so good at that, Thomas, that even during the menstrual cycle, in the luteal phase, when progesterone comes up, so too her insulin resistance is good. Oh, it's spiked up for 2 or 3 days and it goes right back to normal.
This is a revelation. And it's helping lots of things make sense about physiological insulin resistance in these two high growth states of puberty and pregnancy. And it doesn't mean that ice baths are bad.
Right. Oh, no. In fact,
Right.
To answer that question very directly, I would have a hard time believing that's the case in pregnancy. I mean, it certainly might behoove her. No, I mean, there's no way the fetus is going to get cold.
No,
you know, that cannot happen.
Right.
That just can't happen.
I agree.
You know, she may change some of the timing of it or one thing or another, but that fetus is going to be totally fine.
The women who have reported back to me say that their ankle swelling goes down. Okay, the cold's anti-inflammatory. That makes sense. They sleep better. That also makes sense because there's an intense revving up of the metabolism when you're in the cold, and compensatory metabolic mechanisms likely bring you down a little bit at night, and that might help you sleep. They say to me that they feel more mobile. They're walking, probably related to inflammation. And so they report such a positive experience that I had to go look at some of the epidemiological data. Heat is very bad for pregnant women. Stay out of the sauna if you're pregnant. But it turns out that women who are getting some cold exposure through the weather, for example, have better birth outcomes. And this doesn't say anything about mechanisms because it's epidemiological, but it helps reinforce the experience that the pregnant women are reporting back to me.
Yeah. So I realized I didn't address another issue you'd asked, which is what can the woman do about it? You know, to a degree, nothing. Insofar as some of the insulin resistance is supposed to happen. Now, unfortunately, I would say due to lifestyle variables, what they eat, and perhaps they're always too hot or warm, you know, germane to this conversation, the insulin resistance goes too far. And now you've bled from the physiological insulin resistance into pathological. And now you're getting into the range of gestational diabetes. While every pregnant woman is insulin resistant by design, not every pregnant woman, in fact, none, should become diabetic, which is now, you know, insulin resistance, including in pregnancy, is a state of normal glucose. You just need more insulin to keep the glucose normal because you're a little resistant to it. And then when she starts to become so resistant to her own insulin, now the glucose climbs. Now we say you're diabetic, you're gestational diabetic. And to me, the solution is the same as if we were talking to any diabetic. The problem is insulin resistance. We need to just bring it back to normal physiological insulin resistance, which should be reflected in normal glucose. A pregnant woman's glucose levels should not be at 130 milligrams per deciliter. They should be in a normal range. The body defends that range or wants it. You know, I would say, frankly, I think anything below 100 milligrams per deciliter is fine. This is it's admittedly a tangent, but it's been a point of interest for me to look at over time. If you look historically at the recommendations on fasting glucose and what the cutoff is for glycemia to diagnose as diabetes, it's been going down. You know, once upon a time, diabetes was considered a problem if your glucose levels were at 160 milligrams per deciliter. Then it was changed to 140. Then it was 130 something. Now it's 120 something. And I look at that and think, well, why are we lowering the glucose levels? And I'm cynically left to conclude that it's just a really, really good way to diagnose a disease earlier and put them on a drug sooner.
Are you familiar with Welch's book, Overdiagnosed?
I'm not.
It's a great one.
Really?
Yeah, I wish I could send you a link, but let me make
I'll look it up. I'll look it up.
Yeah. He talks about that trend. He says blood pressure was so intriguing because elevated blood pressure, so hypertension, gave a reliable signal despite being asymptomatic. And there are very few diseases that are asymptomatic and worth addressing. But hypertension was one of them. He says, and then there was this huge trend that followed hypertension to say, oh, well, this is a marker of increased risk for this or increased risk for that, and prescribing remedies that were irrelevant, unnecessary, except to drug company profits. So this one model of hypertension that worked well revealed, and I guess it was in the 60s, but revealed to this healthcare industry that you could convince people they had diseases for which they had no symptoms. And then if you lowered the thresholds gradually, which has also happened for hypertension, to a standard that made 80% of the people indicated for this disease for which they have no symptoms, oh my gosh, you can have so many more patients. Welch
isn't that
got
something?
a great argument. Yep.
That's good. I'm going to get that book.
I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah.
I got one more question on the list, and it comes out of Metformin. I've written a couple of articles on the action of Viagra and how it compares to cold exposure. People think Viagra is a male drug for the penis. They don't realize that it's really all of the endothelial cells, and that if you are, you've talked about this on Instagram anyway, and I think you mentioned it in Why We Get Sick. If you're experiencing erectile dysfunction, it's an indication that you're insulin resistant, that your mitochondria are not performing up to par. But when it comes to the endothelial, it's very recent that, gosh, I'm trying to remember the paper, but it's like 2021 or 2022, where they measured endothelial cells, not in a proliferative state, in which case they metabolize via the Warburg effect, but in the state at which they're supposed to be producing nitric oxide. It is the mitochondria that produce ATP to fuel nitric oxide production. And nitric oxide isn't easy to make. You need a lot of energy. So if your mitochondria aren't up to par in your endothelial cells, they will not produce sufficient nitric oxide to induce the vasodilation that is required for an erection. Great. How does Viagra work? Viagra overcomes that insulin resistance. Now I'm going to get a little editorial. It overstimulates the mitochondria so that they are temporarily overperforming. They're producing the ATP that they need to create nitric oxide, and great, you get the vasodilation. But it does nothing to restore the mitochondria to their proper function. There's no long-lasting benefit. You get a few hours and then you're done. I suspect, based upon what you said about metformin, that Viagra could be doing damage to the mitochondria, whereas the cold exposure, it has the same short-term, I can't even make this claim. Cold exposure will restore mitochondrial function. It will be therapeutic for mitochondria in a way that improves vasodilation, improve circulatory system, restore male performance, or restore erectile tissue. Women have it too, to restore the function to erectile tissue. I suspect that Viagra does it by damaging, kind of withdrawing from the mitochondrial bank account, and cold exposure does it by making a deposit in the mitochondrial, metaphorical.
That's a good way to describe it. Yeah. So I don't know too much about this. You know more about it than I do. My only familiarity with nitric oxide was a paper that my colleague published up at the University of Utah, where he found that, once again, ceramides, the same bioactive lipid I mentioned earlier, inhibits nitric oxide synthase, which of course—
Got to be kidding. Okay, this is an incredible coincidence, which exists for a reason. Sorry, I didn't even mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's it.
Yeah,
so once again, now, mind you, I mean, you just for warning you, my postdoc focused on ceramides, these highly active bioactive sphingolipids. So I don't want, naturally I can't help but see some things through the lens of ceramides, but I'm aware enough to realize that there are other goggles waiting here for me to look through. But that is a line of evidence that is very real. I know it exists. I know those studies very well. But yeah, anyway, the ceramide accrual inhibited nitric oxide synthase.
Well, we know enough to say we'd much rather see people in the ice bath than taking metformin. We'd
Oh
much
yeah.
rather see men in the ice bath than taking Viagra. And there's a lot of things that we don't know. If they are taking metformin or they are taking Viagra, we don't know what's really happening to the mitochondria. I mean, we have the paper that says they become fissile, and this isn't good in general. I don't know how that would relate to use of Viagra, and I expect that there's an analogy here. So there's more research to do. For right now, we're sort of doubling down on the benefits of ice bath as this hormetic effect that is training your body or acclimating your body to the stressful environment in ways that makes you healthier. I
Yeah.
think on there, we're on pretty solid ground.
Yes. Oh yeah. I think that's a good way to describe it.